Well, hello, I'm Josh, and I am back once again with another film to tell you about. And this week I'm talking about George Roy Hill's 1973 classic, The Sting. So, The Sting takes place in the 1930s, and it follows this con man named Johnny Hooker. And Johnny, along with some of his other con man buddies, end up tricking this guy out of $11,000. But little did they know, the guy that they tricked was actually a numbers racket courier for the big mobster Doyle Lonigan. And seeking to make an example out of them, Doyle puts out a hit for all of them to be killed. And when Hooker hears of this, he races back to his friend Luther's apartment only to find him dead. And so, after losing his longtime friend and mentor, Hooker decides to go to Chicago and meet up with this man named Henry Gondorff, who Luther spoke of so highly. And together they plan the ultimate con for Lonigan as a way of avenging Luther's death. So as you can see, this thing is another classic pairing of Paul Newman and Robert Redford, who became a huge hit a few years earlier in the Western buddy crime film Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. And so not only was this a kind of repairing of Paul Newman and Robert Redford, but the director of Butch Cassidy, George Roy Hill, also came back for this as well. And they all come together to make a really great film. And along with Paul Newman and Robert Redford, this thing is packed with tons of stars and recognizable faces in general, even if you don't know their name. I think just about everybody in this film has been in several other notable films as well from that era. So it's really cool to see everybody in this, even though it's clearly got two main stars, it's almost kind of an ensemble film. Everyone's working together to make this sting operation work. So it's really fun to see some of your favorite actors and character actors from that era. And I'm sure most people will recognize the big bad guy in this film as Robert Shaw, who's probably most famous for his role as Quint in the Jaws film. But he's another one, if you look up, he's in so many movies. So he's a very well established actor and really at the top of his game at this point. Another really recognizable face you might notice is Charles Durning. And he's another one where you probably don't hear his name that often, but he has been in countless numbers of wildly popular films. I want to say probably one of his more standout roles that most people nowadays are going to remember him for is Pappy O'Daniel in the Coen Brothers film Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? But if you look, he was in a ton of classic 70s movies. A number of times he was playing that kind of police officer role. Probably in that kind of 70s period, he was best known for his role as the police captain in Dog Day Afternoon. And I mean, on top of that, you got like Eileen Brennan, Ray Walston, Harold Gould, and another interesting one, Robert Earl Jones, who you might not recognize him in particular, but his son is actually James Earl Jones. So as you can see, this film has a really great cast to it as well. You know, one of the things I really like about this film is just the 30s setting, and George Roy Hill said that he really tried to recreate that 30s gangster kind of film quality with the lighting and the camera movements. And he worked on this kind of idea together with the cinematographer Robert Surtees, who was a pretty famous cinematographer in his own right. He shot things like Ben-Hur and The Graduate, The Last Picture Show. He'd been doing films since at least the 40s, maybe even the 30s, so he was a very well established cinematographer, and he definitely knew what kind of techniques they would need to do to get that effect that they wanted for the 30s feel of the film. And I found if you look at it through that perspective and try and look at some older 30s and maybe mid 20s gangster films that kind of have that similar setting, you can really see some similarities with the cinematography. Obviously, the handful of zooms that are in this are not going to be prevalent in 30s films, but really a lot of the lighting techniques and some of just the ways that they tell the story are very reminiscent of the techniques from that era in Hollywood. And if you really want to get into it, I did a little test myself and I changed the TV settings to make it black and white, and there are definitely a good amount of shots that, if they weren't widescreen, would have looked like they just came out of a 30s film. But yeah, as someone who loves classic films of the 30s, 40s, 20s, whatever. I really enjoyed the visual style and kind of callbacks they were doing with this. And on top of that, on a story level, this film is great as well. The script, which was written by David S. Ward, has this great quality to it where it makes you feel like you're in on the con with all the guys. But it also leaves you out of the loop enough that it keeps you guessing on what's going to happen next. And it was so good, it really set a new standard for what a good kind of caper film was. The other thing I like about it is just how well it balances the lighthearted humor of the film with how tense and serious it can get at times. And the group's previous film, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, also had this kind of aspect to it as well. And apparently David S. Ward was originally going to direct this film himself. But when the project started getting much bigger than he had originally anticipated, and with realizing how complicated this film was, he decided it was probably best to have a more experienced director make it. And another interesting aspect of the film that deserves recognition is just the attention to detail within it. I mean, the plot alone, with all the twists and turns it takes, and small details that you probably missed the first time, but also the whole costume, makeup, production design level of the film is incredible as well. And when I was talking earlier about the cinematography, the lighting, and the framing being so similar to 30s films and so evocative of that era, really none of that would have gotten across if it weren't for the excellent and realistic set design and costuming. Now, the costumes were designed by the very iconic Edith Head, who, if you look her up on IMDb or watch TCM for any extended period of time, you will see that she worked on a ton of films. And she actually won her final Oscar for this film, The Sting. It also happened to be her 8th Oscar, so you can see she was a pretty big deal back in those days. And as you can see, along with the costume design and everything, they did such a good job picking out the colors of the film as well. Since they're still trying to create that old-timey kind of feel to it, they stick mostly to muted browns and greens, really trying to recreate the era, and still trying to give it a little bit of that black and white monochromatic feel, even though it's in color. Another interesting aspect of the film is the music. To accompany the title cards and mark different shifts in the film, you'll notice that they incorporate a lot of Scott Joplin ragtime music into the film. And this choice works really well. It helps establish that kind of playful aspect of the film. The interesting thing, though, is ragtime music was more popular in the early 1900s than it was in the 30s. By the time the 30s came around, jazz had become a much more popular musical choice. But still, the choice of ragtime works incredibly well, probably better than if they had used jazz. It just fits the kind of tongue-in-cheek tone that they're going for in the film. So I really love the music. And surprisingly, because of this film, Scott Joplin actually became very popular in the 70s. And the soundtrack became quite popular as well. I actually have found this at a used bookstore. Here you got The Sting on vinyl. So as you can see, it was adapted by a guy named Marvin Hamlish. But yeah, so it's a really interesting soundtrack. Not necessarily the intuitive choice, being that it comes from an era that was 20 years earlier than the one you're actually depicting, but it's just perfect for the film and really sets you up for this kind of old-timey, nostalgic kind of era that you're going to be entering into. And so when the film released back in 1973, it was received with huge critical acclaim. The film was nominated for 10 Oscars and won 7 of them, something that's pretty rare for a more lighthearted thriller comedy. It won for Best Picture, Best Directing, Best Screenplay, Best Set Decoration, Best Costume Design, Best Film Editing, Best Music, pretty much all the big ones. And an interesting thing I found while I was researching that year's Academy Awards, apparently that was the year that a streaker ran behind David Niven while he was setting up the Best Picture award. Anyways, I think that's about all I have about this film. It's a wonderful period comedy thriller, I guess you could say, heist film. It's got great actors, great direction, great everything, as you can see by the amount of Oscars it won. And so if you'd like to watch this film, I believe it's available online, pretty much all the usual streaming sites, generally as a rent or buy option. I don't think I've seen this available to stream on Netflix or anything like that, but I don't know, keep your eyes peeled for that. And physically, the one I have right here is the Blu-ray special edition they did a few years back for the Universal 100th anniversary. So it's a pretty good set. I think there might also be a book version of this as well. You know, you might have seen some of those book editions. But yeah, the one I found, as you can see, is just in the standard Blu-ray case. Still really good. Got a pretty good amount of bonus features, and the picture is very clear as well. I thought they did a pretty good job on the restoration of it. And I just looked up, there apparently is a 4K Blu-ray out now. If you're into that, if you've got the equipment for it, I'm sure that looks really good. But yeah, quite a fun movie to check out. So now it's time for the comment question, and I'm wondering, what is your favorite period film? I talked quite a lot about this film and how they did so much to evoke the era of the 30s. So I'm wondering, what are some other films that you guys have seen that you thought really evoked that time period and really did a good job of making you feel like the film was set in a different era? And it's not always as easy as having people put on hippie glasses and a funny wig and saying it's the 60s. It actually takes a lot of work, if you want to do it well, in order to not just tell you it's a different time period, but to actually show you and make you believe it is. So yeah, put some of your favorites in the comment section below and start discussing. Other than that, hit the like button if you enjoyed this video and subscribe if you want to see more. Be sure to keep watching movies and have a great rest of your day.